I shouldn't be teaching you this, but here we are. Have you ever wondered why the truths that could free us are often the ones no one dares to say out loud? The world feeds us noise, distractions, and endless advice, but the things that actually shift your life, the raw and dangerous truths, are kept hidden, maybe out of fear, maybe out of control, or maybe because once you hear them, you can no longer pretend, you can no longer live the same way. Think about it. How much of your life has been shaped by unspoken rules, by the silent agreement to play small, to follow the script, to fit into the cage built by someone else's idea of success and happiness? What if that cage is exactly what has been keeping you from yourself? This isn't just another motivational moment. This is an unmasking, a conversation you weren't supposed to have, and once you allow these words to reach you, there will be no going back. So, let me ask you, are you ready to hear the truth that no one else will give you? Are you ready to confront the mirror you've been avoiding? Because the moment you do, you'll understand why I shouldn't be teaching you this. The conflict begins with the way we are raised to believe in a set of rules that sound comforting on the surface, but are quietly destructive underneath. We are told to be good, polite, agreeable, and everything will fall into place. That blueprint is handed to us as though it were sacred, yet it ignores the complexity of life and the raw unpredictability of human nature. It makes us think that obedience will bring us freedom, when in reality, it creates a quiet prison of conformity. It is easier to manage people who believe this story because they will regulate themselves, trimming down their edges, swallowing their doubts, polishing away the fire that once burned in them. This is the conflict between what the world says will fulfill you and what your inner voice knows to be true. When you sense the contradiction, you start to question whether life is supposed to feel this small, whether you were born only to fit neatly into roles written long before you arrived. The discomfort you feel isn't weakness, it is the beginning of seeing through the illusion, the beginning of realizing the promises you were sold might have been designed to keep you tame. Machiavelli observed centuries ago that people are driven more by fear than by love, and the uncomfortable truth is that much of our conditioning is built upon that principle. Families, institutions, and systems rely on fear to shape behavior, whether it's the fear of failure, rejection, or shame. We're subtly warned that standing out too much will isolate us, that saying what we really think will cost us acceptance, that chasing our own vision will make us selfish. But think about it. Who benefits from you shrinking yourself down? Certainly not you. The moment you give in to these fears, you become predictable, easy to control, part of a machinery that rewards obedience more than authenticity. And yet, deep inside, there is something in you that resists, that whispers in moments of solitude that you were meant for more than this. The conflict sharpens when that whisper grows louder than the noise of approval, seeking when you realize that fitting in comes at the cost of losing yourself. Society wants you polished on the surface but hollow within, and the most dangerous part is that it disguises hollowness as success. You're told to chase the degree, the promotion, the house, the applause, but once you achieve them, the satisfaction fades like smoke. That is the hidden cruelty of this script. It keeps you running, but never arriving, always believing that the next milestone will finally fill the void. And the more you chase, the more you abandon the raw edges of yourself that gave you life in the first place. What makes this conflict unbearable is that most people sense it but bury the realization under busyness, distraction, or temporary pleasures. It is easier to drown in noise than to confront the silence that asks the real questions. Yet you know that somewhere along the way, you traded wonder for stability, creativity for safety, authenticity for approval. And the longer you live inside that trade, the further you drift from the person you might have been, if you had listened to yourself instead of the crowd. The mind wrestles with this every day. On one side, there is the lure of acceptance, the comfort of belonging, the reassurance of following a tested path. On the other side, there is the gnawing hunger to step outside the pattern and claim something untamed. It is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, it is survival of the self. The paradox is cruel. When you follow the world's expectations, you look stable, but feel empty. When you follow your inner calling, you risk rejection, but you taste a rare kind of aliveness. This inner battle is not trivial. It is the very core of human conflict. To choose between the illusion of safety and the reality of growth is to choose whether you will exist or whether you will truly live. And the truth is, no one can make this decision for you. The voices around you can pressure, but the final betrayal or the final liberation will always come from within, when you either silence yourself to remain accepted or speak your truth and embrace the consequences. Think about the subtle ways you've been trained to mute your own instincts. You've been told to measure your worth by how useful you are to others, how likable you appear, how closely you match the script. You've been praised for being agreeable, for following orders, for blending in rather than standing out. And maybe it worked for a while. Maybe you felt safe in that compliance. But safety comes with its own hidden cost. Every time you suppress your real thoughts, every time you say yes when your soul screams no, every time you accept less than you deserve just to keep peace, you chip away at the core of your being. Over time, you begin to wonder why life feels heavy, why your days blur together, why joy feels like a memory instead of a presence. The conflict is not outside of you, it is inside. The fracture between the self you perform for the world and the self you bury deep where no one can see. The weight of this conflict is multiplied by the culture of comparison that defines modern life. You're not only pressured to follow the script, you're forced to measure your success against everyone else who's performing the same act. Social media has turned life into a stage where everyone flaunts the highlight reel, pretending they're fulfilled by the very things that leave them hollow. You scroll and compare, convincing yourself that maybe you just haven't reached their level of polish yet. But comparison is the sharpest weapon of conformity, because it blinds you to your own path. Instead of asking what would make you truly alive, you ask how to measure up to the illusion. And so you drift further from yourself, further from the raw, unfiltered truth you've buried under layers of expectation. The cruelest irony is that everyone else is trapped in the same performance, but no one wants to admit it, so the cycle continues, each person reinforcing the illusion for fear of being the one to break it. The conflict, at its core, is a spiritual one. It is about identity, about whether you will define yourself from the inside out, or allow the outside world to define you from the inside in. It is about courage versus comfort, authenticity versus approval, freedom versus control. And while it may sound abstract, the effects are brutally real. Entire lives are lived under the weight of expectations never questioned. Entire dreams are abandoned because they didn't align with the script. Entire souls are dulled because they never risked being misunderstood. And the tragedy is that the world does not mourn the loss of those selves. It rewards the compliance. You might be celebrated for betraying yourself because you made others comfortable. But deep down, you will know. You will feel the fracture every time silence grows heavy, every time the night feels long, every time you catch a glimpse of who you could have been had you chosen differently. And that is the essence of the conflict. The endless pull between the life you were trained to live and the life you were meant to live. Maybe you have found yourself in a crowded room, surrounded by people who are laughing, smiling, carrying on conversations, and yet you feel like a stranger in the middle of it all. You nod, you force a smile, you add a word or two, but inside you hear a voice whispering, "This isn't me." It's a strange loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from being alone but from being unseen. You are there physically, but your soul is absent, hidden behind the mask of who you think you're supposed to be. These moments are painful because they reveal the distance between who you are and who you perform to be. The conflict becomes sharper when you realize that the people around you have accepted the mask, but they don't truly know the person underneath. That realization can feel suffocating, as if you are trapped inside your own life, watching yourself play a role that drains you more with each passing day. Think of the times you've worked tirelessly toward a goal that wasn't even yours. A promotion, a recognition, a title that society convinced you would validate your worth. You sacrificed your time, your energy, your creativity, and when the moment of recognition finally came, it felt empty. You smiled, you nodded, you thanked the people who praised you, but when you went home and sat with yourself, it didn't fill the silence inside. The applause faded, the compliments echoed for a moment, then vanished. You were left with the same aching emptiness, the same unshakable sense that no matter how much approval you collected, something essential was still missing. That is the cruel irony. Chasing approval often leads you further from yourself, because the more you succeed by the world's terms, the more you abandon your own. Maybe you've lived through a relationship, whether romantic, professional, or even within your family, where you gave and gave, hoping that if you sacrificed enough of yourself, you would finally feel valued. You softened your opinions, you ignored your instincts, you bent over backwards to keep the peace. And yet the more you gave, the less respect you seemed to receive. You were praised for your patience, for your loyalty, but deep down you knew you weren't being seen. You were being used. And when you finally broke, when you could no longer silence your real needs, the same people who benefited from your silence suddenly called you difficult, selfish, or ungrateful. That moment is devastating, but it is also clarifying. It shows you that as long as you abandon yourself, others will too. Respect begins with the boundaries you refuse to cross, even if it means losing approval. There is a unique pain that comes from betraying yourself repeatedly. It doesn't show on the outside right away, but it builds like rust on metal, eating away at your spirit. You may still smile, still laugh, still go through the motions of daily life, but inside you begin to feel heavy, like you are carrying a weight you can't quite name. You start to dread the quiet moments, because in the silence, the truth becomes too loud. You distract yourself with noise, with screens, with endless tasks, but no matter how much you run, the feeling follows you. The transformation begins the day you stop running, the day you sit with that heaviness and admit, I am living someone else's life. That confession is painful, but it is also the doorway to freedom, because only by facing it can you begin to reclaim what you lost. We've all had those fleeting moments where the illusion cracks, when you catch a glimpse of the life you could be living if fear weren't in control. Maybe it was a time you spoke up and felt the power of your own voice. Maybe it was a moment of solitude, walking in nature, when you remembered what it felt like to breathe without performing. Maybe it was a creative spark, an idea, a vision that lit you up from within, before the world told you it wasn't practical. These flashes of authenticity are rare, but they are unforgettable. They haunt you precisely because they reveal what's possible. And once you've tasted that possibility, no amount of conformity can erase the memory. You might bury it, but it lingers like a shadow, reminding you of who you could be, if you were brave enough to follow through. Social criticism fits here too, because our culture thrives on keeping people distracted from these realizations. Look around and you'll see how everything is designed to keep you consuming instead of questioning. Entertainment, advertisements, even education, all crafted to make you fit in, to keep you busy, to prevent you from asking the dangerous questions like, what do I really want? Who am I without the labels? What would my life look like if I stopped chasing approval? When you begin to ask those questions, you threaten the system, because a person who knows their worth can't be easily manipulated. And so, the world offers endless distractions to drown out the questions. Scroll, watch, shop, repeat. The transformation begins when you finally pause, when you refuse to numb yourself, when you choose awareness over anesthesia. At some point, every person faces a breaking moment. Maybe it's subtle, maybe it's dramatic, but it always feels the same. The life you built no longer fits, the clothes feel too tight, the walls close in, the script you've memorized feels suffocating. It is terrifying because to acknowledge it means you must change, and change always carries the risk of loss. But in that breaking lies the possibility of awakening. It is the point where some people collapse under the weight of expectations, and others begin to rise. To rise doesn't mean to burn everything down overnight. It means to choose honesty over performance, to choose courage over fear, to choose yourself over the illusion. That is the essence of relatable experience. The recognition that every scar, every empty applause, every silent scream has been leading you here, not to destruction, but to transformation. Awakening rarely arrives with fireworks or applause. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic shifts. More often it arrives quietly, like dawn after a long night, almost unnoticed at first. You may wake one morning and realize you're no longer afraid of the silence that used to suffocate you. You may walk into a room and suddenly feel how unnatural it is to keep wearing the mask you once thought was necessary. Awakening feels less like an explosion and more like a slow unraveling of lies. A gentle but persistent peeling away of illusions until what remains is something raw, something true. It isn't comfortable, but it is real, and real is what you've been craving all along. This moment doesn't free you from difficulty. It frees you from the need to pretend. The beauty of awakening lies in the way it transforms solitude. Where once you may have feared being alone, now you discover that solitude is not emptiness but space. It is the soil where self-respect grows, where your voice finds its strength, where your soul breathes without interruption. You begin to understand that silence isn't your enemy but your teacher. The quiet moments that once exposed your inner conflict now reveal your resilience. Instead of fearing them, you begin to seek them, to protect them, to use them as sanctuaries where you can realign with what is true. In solitude, you discover that you don't need constant validation, because your worth is no longer something handed to you by others. It is something that rises from within, unshakable and enduring. When you look back at your scars, awakening changes the way you see them. They are no longer sources of shame or reminders of failure. They become proof, living evidence that you have endured, that you have faced the storms and survived. Each scar is a chapter, a record of your resilience, a mark of your refusal to disappear. Instead of hiding them, you begin to honor them, to let them remind you of what you've overcome. They no longer weigh you down, they lift you, because you realize that strength is not the absence of wounds, but the courage to live with them openly. Awakening teaches you that scars do not disfigure, they define. They are the map of where you've been, and the compass guiding you toward where you are meant to go. The awakening also alters the way you see strength itself. You no longer confuse loudness with power or constant motion with progress. You begin to sense a deeper strength, the kind that moves silently but reshapes everything it touches. It's in the patience to wait when the world rushes, the courage to walk away when everyone else complies, the steadiness to remain grounded when everything else shakes. But awakening teaches you that real strength isn't about conquering others but mastering yourself. It isn't about control but clarity. It isn't about proving anything but living in alignment with your own truth. In this strength, you don't need to shout. You radiate. You don't need to dominate. You simply exist in a way that cannot be ignored. The shift extends into the way you relate to others. Before, you may have relied on their approval, shaped your actions around their opinions, dimmed your light to make them comfortable. But now you see clearly. The relationships that require you to betray yourself are not worth keeping. Awakening reveals who truly values you and who only valued your compliance. It can be painful to watch certain connections fall away, but it is also liberating. You realize that losing what was false makes space for what is real. The people who remain, the ones who love you for your essence and not your performance, become treasures instead of obligations. And for the first time, you understand that being fully yourself is not arrogance, it is honesty. Awakening is not without fear. In fact, it often intensifies fear at first, because you are stepping into a space where certainty dissolves. But what makes this different is that the fear no longer rules you. You feel it, you acknowledge it, and you move forward anyway. Courage takes on a new meaning. It isn't about being fearless, but about walking into the unknown, despite trembling hands and racing thoughts. Awakening sharpens your vision, showing you that the fear you carried for so long was not a wall but a veil. Once you pierce it, you see how much of your life was limited by illusions. And though fear doesn't vanish, it loses its power to chain you. It becomes a companion, not a master. At its deepest level, awakening is not about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who you were before the world told you to be less. It's about remembering the innocence, the curiosity, the hunger for life that you buried to survive. It's about reclaiming the voice you silenced, the dreams you abandoned, the fire you thought was extinguished. It is not an addition, but a subtraction. The stripping away of everything false until only the essential remains. And in that essence, you find peace. Not the peace of a life without struggle, but the peace of knowing that whatever comes, you will face it as yourself. That is the quiet revolution of awakening. Not that you conquer the world, but that you finally stop betraying yourself. So here we are, at the place where words are no longer just words but mirrors. I told you I shouldn't be teaching you this, and maybe that's true, because what I've shared with you can't be unlearned. Once the curtain has been pulled back, once you've seen how much of your life has been shaped by illusions and quiet agreements, You can't slip back into ignorance without feeling the fracture. The conclusion of all this is not neat or comfortable. It's a challenge. It demands that you look at yourself not as a collection of roles, but as a living being with a pulse, with a voice, with a story that has been waiting to be written honestly. This is not about rejecting the world entirely, but about refusing to let it own you. The moment you claim that refusal, something irreversible happens. You begin to live as if your life truly belongs to you, and that changes everything. The real revolution is not banners and crowds and slogans. The real revolution is invisible, unfolding quietly in the human heart. It happens when one person decides they are no longer willing to be defined by approval, when they stop running after applause, when they begin to create meaning from within rather than begging from within, from without. That revolution doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but it alters the entire fabric of a life. Imagine what happens when you stop living to please a system that feeds on your compliance. Imagine what happens when your choices are no longer ruled by fear of rejection. The world may not notice immediately, but you will. And that inner shift radiates outward in ways you cannot predict, because a person who is free inside cannot be controlled in the same way again. This transformation is not without cost, and that's why so few choose it. You may lose people who only knew you as the agreeable version of yourself. You may step away from paths that once seemed safe. You may even experience moments of profound loneliness as you leave behind the crowd that walked comfortably in the illusion. But loneliness here is not the same as emptiness. It is the solitude of someone walking a path that is narrow but true. And in that solitude, you discover resilience that can't be found in the noise of conformity. The scars, the silence, the fears, they all become part of the story of becoming. You stop longing for validation because you realize that the validation you were chasing was a cage. Better to stand alone in truth than to be celebrated in falsehood. That realization is painful, but it is also pure freedom. Think of how much of human suffering comes from the simple act of forgetting who we are. We pile layers of expectation, duty, comparison, and fear onto ourselves until the self beneath becomes unrecognizable. Awakening is the process of peeling back those layers, of remembering the childlike curiosity, the fire, the dignity that were there before the world told you to shrink. And the conclusion to all of this is clear. The work of life is not to add more, but to return to what was already inside you. That return is the revolution. That return is the victory. When you walk through the world with nothing to prove and everything to live for, the very ground beneath your feet feels different. The weight lifts not because the world changes, but because you have. There will always be noise outside, voices urging you to conform, to play small, to trade your authenticity for approval. That noise will not disappear just because you have awakened. But something profound happens when you stop craving their permission. You begin to listen more to the stillness inside than the shouting outside. That is where clarity lives. That is where strength lives. The conclusion is not that life becomes easy. It never will. But that life becomes yours. And there is no greater power than to walk through chaos with the calm of someone who knows who they are. No crowd can offer that. No applause can give that. Only you can cultivate it, and once it's yours, it cannot be taken away. Though the call to action is not loud, it is not a command or a demand, it is a whisper in the soul, asking you to choose truth over illusion, inner revolution over outer validation. To sit in silence tonight and ask yourself honestly whether you are living as yourself or as a character written for you by others. The answer may sting, but it will also save you. The world doesn't need more polished masks. It needs more people alive in their raw, unfiltered essence. That is why I shouldn't be teaching you this, because once you know, you can no longer hide comfortably. But maybe that's the point. Maybe here we are, because you were meant to hear this at the exact moment when you were ready to stop surviving and start becoming.